This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Sometimes these lists also look at the worst cards ever, but we're actually not doing either of those things today. Instead, we're taking a look at the Magic cards that have the weirdest original text. These days, templating and quality control have mostly made it so that card text is standardized, and there is rarely a word or words that show up in a text box that are unique or strange. However, that hasn't always been the case, and there are lots of Magic cards with very weird original text, and in this video, I'll be giving you my picks for the 10 weirdest examples. I should note that this video isn't about the most complex Magic cards ever. That's actually something I covered in an MTG Top 10 in the past, and it also isn't a list of the wackiest cards ever. That's something I've also covered in the past. Both of those lists are really about what a card actually does, and how crazy complicated or wacky they are, while this list is really just about the contents of the text box. In other words, it's all about text that is strange, and that doesn't necessarily mean the actual effect the card has is complicated. Now, there is a small amount of overlap with those two previous lists, as some cards that are really complicated or wacky also have weird text boxes, but for the most part, they're completely different lists. Also, as the title implies, we're only looking at weird original text on cards, so we aren't talking about updated Oracle wording, which tends to use the current templating. Alright, let's get to my list. At number 10, I've got Lden Warlord. The Warlord says the X's below are the number of non-wall creatures on your side, including Warlord. The whole X's below phrasing would seem really strange on modern cards. It's much less wordy to just say power and toughness are equal to, but back in Alpha they hadn't figured that out. The Warlord gets even weirder with its original text because it goes on to give you examples of its size and how it will change. Now, Magic was a brand new game, so I can't fault them for doing this, but the amount of detail it goes into in explaining how its power and toughness changes is just odd, and far more detail than we would ever see in reminder text today. The specific example it gives you is, thus, if you have two other non-wall creatures, Warlord is 3/3. If one of those creatures is killed during the turn, Warlord immediately becomes a 2/2. It's just funny that the current Oracle text has about 1,000 fewer words, since it just goes with, Lden Warlord's power and toughness are each equal to the number of non-wall creatures you control. At number 9, it is Obsidian Fireheart. This is a much more recent card than everything else on this list, and it's got weird text both on the card itself and in the Oracle. So, with the Fireheart, you can pay 1 generic and 2 red to put a blaze counter on a land, and lands with blaze counters do 1 to your opponent on every upkeep. The unusual thing here is the reminder text, which notes the land continues to burn after Obsidian Fireheart has left the battlefield. The flavor here is neat, but referring to the lands as burning is a very weird thing to see on a more recent Magic card. The fact that the reminder text is preserved in the Oracle makes it extra unique. At number 8, it's book burning. The way this is originally worded, combined with when the first line ends, leads to a lot of people misunderstanding this card, and that's pretty understandable. People often think that the first line means, unless a player owns book burning, deal 6 damage to him or her, put the top 6 cards of target player's library into his or her graveyard. So people often think this does 6 damage and mills 6 cards for 2 mana, provided the opponent doesn't have a book burning in their hand. This isn't completely crazy to think because has can indeed mean own, and the line space comes at a place where all you would need to do is add a comma, and then thinking that was the effect is actually grammatically correct. This is a misunderstanding that does continue to this day. This card has appeared on one of my worst top 10s before, and in the comments you'll find plenty of people telling me I don't understand how this card works and it's way better than I think. In reality, the way it works is that your opponent either chooses to take 6 damage or mill 6 cards. This has been cleared up in the Oracle text, which says any player may have book burning deal 6 damage to them. If no one does, target player mills 6 cards. This wording is much clearer, and the way they chose to word it originally is just really odd and confusing too. At number 7, I have Floral Spasm. In this case, the original text says, if Floral Spasm attacks an opponent and is not blocked, then Floral Spasm may choose to destroy target artifact under that opponent's control and deal no damage. This one is weird because it assigns some agency to this piece of cardboard, since it says, Floral Spasm may choose. This is a classic example of weird and inconsistent templating because no other Magic cards, even at the time, used this sort of language, making Floral Spasm super weird even back then. At number 6, it is Illusionary Mask. This card is super confusing and it also has some very strange wording. The original text says you can pay X, and then you can summon a creature face down so an opponent doesn't know what it is. The X cost can be any amount of mana, even 0. It serves to hide the true casting cost of the creature, which you still have to spend. The weird part here is the whole "it serves to hide the true casting cost of the creature" thing. You may also notice that the face-down creature doesn't have any stats to speak of, it's just a face-down creature. The card is really complicated, and figuring out how it works isn't easy, especially if you're relying on the original text. The Oracle text has cleared things up significantly, as it often does, including making the creature into a face-down 2/2, like most face-down creatures in Magic are. At number 5, I have both Chaos Orb and Falling Star. These cards are weird in terms of their wording, and also really weird in terms of their effect. For both of these, you pay a cost and flip the card over the play area, and then whatever the orb or star hits has bad stuff happen to it. The great part about both of these is all of the detail involved with that flip. There's a specific height you have to reach on the flip, and it has to turn over too, or it doesn't count. Even with all these details, there's still a lack of detail about how this card works. In particular, it doesn't say that the defending player can't move their stuff around to dodge them, and there is of course also the famous story of someone tearing up their orb and flipping it over the table to destroy everything. But yeah, these types of cards are really odd in today's Magic, so much so that there's some of the few cards that are outright banned in Vintage. Crazy thing is, Chaos Orb was played at Magic's first competitive tournament ever, the 1994 World Championships, and some games really were decided by how well a player could flip this card. At number 4, I have Raging River. Kind of like what we saw with Obsidian Fireheart, Raging River has some very flavorful and very strange original wording. It says, when you attack, non-flying defending creatures must be divided as the opponent wishes between the left and right side of the river. You then choose on which side of the river to place each attacking creature, and attacking creatures can only be blocked by flying creatures or those on the same side of the river. So, yeah, this is another card that refers to itself in a very flavorful way. The idea here is that creatures can only fight each other if they're on the same side of the river, or they can fly, and this is conveyed pretty well by the original text. It's actually kind of a bummer that they decided to take the flavor away from this one, since now it just has the player divide them into 2 piles. Obsidian Fireheart got to keep its weird text, but not Raging River. At number 3, it's Goblin Game, a card where there is really weird text and a crazy effect. Fittingly, it has you and the people you're playing with play a minigame, where you and the other players all hide stuff. That's right, this black-bordered card instructs you and your fellow players to grab things and hide them. Every player loses 1 life for each item they hide, then whoever has the fewest objects ends up losing the minigame and loses half of their life. This is definitely one of the weirdest cards in Magic that's actually legal in tournament Magic, and its effect hasn't really been changed at all by the current Oracle text, where the minigame is still intact. There are some rulings on Gatherer that are pretty funny, but they're also necessary to more specifically outline how this minigame works. For example, it tells you you have to choose the objects you're hiding beforehand, and it also says that you can just write down a number on a piece of paper if you don't have anything to hide. At number 2, it's Rock Hydra. This is another card where the original text conveyed some fun flavor, as it says, put X +1/+1 counters, heads, on Hydra. Each point of damage Hydra suffers destroys 1 head unless red is spent. During upkeep, new heads may be grown for 3 red apiece. So, obviously Hydras are monsters with multiple heads and the ability to gain new ones, so the idea that +1/+1 counters are heads makes a ton of sense, and actually it's a design we see on Hydras pretty much to this very day. However, Rock Hydra is the only time where the +1/+1 counters are blatantly said to equal heads in the text box. And while informing us of that flavor is neat, it's also something that doesn't really need to be spelled out for such a flavorful effect, and that's why the Oracle text no longer says the word head anywhere on it. And at number 1, I have Tempest Efreet. These all have a text box that's a real treat, but obviously this one's at number 1, so it's a real doozy, so let's just go ahead and read the first part of it. It says, pick a card at random from an opponent's hand and place it in yours. Bury Tempest Efreet in opponent's graveyard. The change in ownership is permanent. Play as an interrupt, but opponent may prevent this effect by paying 10 life points or by conceding the game before the card to be switched is chosen. If this is done, Tempest Efreet is buried. Yeah, if that's not weird, I don't know what is. The strangeness of this card is partly a result of the whole playing for ante aspect of Magic that existed only very briefly. In the early days, every game of Magic, if you were playing for ante, basically had each player put a random card into a pool, and whoever won the game won both the cards. That in itself is pretty strange, But the way Tempest Efreet works alongside playing for anti is extra strange, and that's why it's the anti card I chose to put on this list, because many of them could have made it. So basically, the whole point of the Efreet is to use it to steal a random card from your opponent's hand, effectively giving them your Efreet in exchange for their card. And the change here, as the card says, is permanent. That's how anti worked. So if you get a Black Lotus out of the deal, it's yours forever. That's weird enough, but my favorite part are the two ways you can ignore this effect, either by paying 10 life, or just conceding the game. That's right, this card's original rules told you that you could just quit if your opponent had a chance to take a card you really cared about. Weird thing is, it's pretty specific about when you can concede. It had to be before the card is randomly chosen. If you wait too long, the original text on this card seems to indicate you can't do anything about it. It's also pretty funny that it tells you what to do with the Efreet if your opponent does concede, which is that it gets buried, or in other words, destroyed and it can't regenerate. I'm glad we know where it goes if your opponent concedes in response. So yeah, Tempest Efreet has truly weird wording, and that's why I have it at number 1 on this list. So those are my picks for the 10 Magic cards with the weirdest original wording. Are there any cards you think should have been included on this list? Let me know in the comments. Also go ahead and like this video if you enjoyed it. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're interested in catching up on past MTG Top 10s, including more in this same sort of category, like the most complicated or wackiest Magic cards ever, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.